The Subcommittee on Border Security Facilitation and Operations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to receive testimony on the Department of Homeland Security's family separation policy. Today we are continuing the oversight we began at the full committee level earlier this month during our hearing with Secretary Nielsen. I thank our legal advocates and medical experts who have joined us this morning for their willingness to testify and share their firsthand knowledge of the current state of our southern border. Last summer, the Department of Homeland Security, under the leadership of Secretary Nielsen, implemented a zero-tolerance policy which resulted in the separation of thousands of families. Despite knowing beforehand that this policy would immediately lead to family separations, DHS and specifically U.S. Customs and Border Protection were completely unprepared and ill-equipped for the massive and delicate undertaking of sheltering thousands of separated children with an unknown number of babies and toddlers. To make matters worse, within days of this policy's enactment, it became abundantly clear that none of the federal agencies involved had any systems in place to effectively keep track of and reunite separated family members. And the few systems that did exist were found to be severely deficient, according to multiple reviews by the Government Accountability Office and the Inspectors General of both DHS and the Department of Health and Human Services. This means that the reunification of family members was either an afterthought of this administration or simply not prioritized at all. Due to their lack of preparations and planning, DHS has still failed to fully account for the total number of migrant children that were separated from their families over the past 2 years. Even more shocking is that DHS still has broad authority to separate families based on a set of vague criteria which agents can apply at their own discretion. Like all of my colleagues, I am deeply committed to combating human trafficking at our southern border. But the family separations that took place last summer had nothing to do with preventing human trafficking. In fact, multiple former administration officials have openly acknowledged the zero-tolerance policy was first and foremost an effort to deter unlawful immigration. To me and to many of my colleagues on our committee, this means that any criteria or justification that this administration uses to separate families at the border today must be carefully scrutinized and subject to congressional oversight. Congress has a responsibility to continue questioning DHS's implementation of zero tolerance, its handling of families and children in its custody, its compliance with reunification efforts, and the standards used to determine if a family should be separated. But DHS's family separation policy is just one element that we intend to examine today. Under the Trump administration, DHS has pursued increasingly restrictive immigration policies at our southern border that are having devastating humanitarian consequences. At various ports of entry, CBP has been regulating the number of asylum seekers, many of them families, who can present themselves daily. This metering practice has led to long wait lists and backlogs that have driven some families to seek access to our asylum process through other and often more dangerous means, such as traveling through remote areas of the border to find Border Patrol agents. These parts of the border are often not well prepared or appropriately resourced to handle families and unaccompanied children. Meanwhile, other asylum seekers and families are being asked to remain in Mexico while their cases make their way through our immigration courts. Secretary Nielsen and others in this administration are choosing to unilaterally reshape our asylum process, and these so-called migrant protection protocols are putting already vulnerable people, including young unaccompanied children, at greater risk. We have laws and procedures in place to protect migrant children and families seeking asylum. There is a reason why these laws exist, and we need to ensure that our immigration process operates squarely within those boundaries. Today's hearing is intended to give our members an opportunity to hear from legal and medical experts who have been at the southern border for several years and who have seen firsthand how DHS screens and processes family units, manages detention facilities, and facilitates health care. I look forward to hearing from each of our expert witnesses about their experiences and what they took away from their visits to the border. Next week, we are planning to visit the Texas-Mexico border, and your testimony today will help inform us of the various issues that we must explore while on the ground. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for an opening statement.
I thank my colleague, Chairwoman Rice, and I especially thank our witnesses for joining us today. My friends across the aisle will perhaps spend some time today criticizing strict enforcement of our immigration laws. I believe what we should discuss are the loopholes in our immigration laws that fuel criminal organizations and their propaganda, responsible for convincing hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people from Central America to make the treacherous journey to our southwest border. Human smuggling frequently can lead to sexual assault and sex trafficking, endangering the lives of thousands of women and children. Because we have not invested enough resources in securing our southwest border, to criminal organizations, the benefits clearly outweigh the consequences. They extort money, cash, and smuggling fees from migrants while expanding their control of areas in Central America. We know of the horrible conditions these families and children experience on their journey to our border, including the very real threat of separation, assault, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking that occurs at the hands of cartels, smugglers, and coyotes. I'm grateful for all of our witnesses for joining us today to share your particular area of expertise, and we appreciate your passion, your love for America, and by extension, the children that are entering our country illegally. It's quite a crisis. I'm grateful that Mr. Ballard could join us today as a witness to speak in more detail about human trafficking cases that exist due to a lack of security along our southwest border. Needed enhanced security. I know he'll provide case examples from his law enforcement experience in the CIA and working for Homeland Security Investigations Unit. This is exactly what America needs to hear. Our nation is generous and compassionate. We accept over 1 million legal immigrants into our country every year, and we're on track to shelter more persecuted individuals with asylum under this administration than the last. In fact, 5,638 people were granted asylum in 2018, compared to less than half that number in 2016. Due to loopholes in our immigration laws, people attempting to illegally enter our country with the intent to stay are creating extreme backlogs in our process. These immigrants are told that once they step foot on U.S. soil, they can stay. This is what they're told by the cartels and the traffickers. The truth is that most asylum claims prove to be illegitimate, and of further concern is the fact that about 40% of people requesting asylum in 2018 never filed an actual application. That's 14,072 people who passed a credible fear screening. They're trained on how to pass credible fear screening, and then decided they did not actually need to apply for asylum. They likely disappeared into the interior of our country. Criminal organizations tell migrants that children can be used as de facto visas, making them vulnerable targets for smugglers and human traffickers who know that after 20 days, families and minors must be released into the interior. We've seen major spikes in unaccompanied minors and family units over the last 5 years, incredible increases. We're now seeing the greatest number of families attempting to illegally enter our country in our nation's history, and those numbers are only expected to rise. And because my more liberal colleagues, many of whom I greatly respect and admire, continue to obstruct needed funding for enhanced border security, 84% of migrants are arriving between ports of entry and crossing illegally. The reality is, every single day, women are sexually assaulted on the journey to our southwest border. Children do not receive adequate food, water, and shelter, and sometimes people are forced into labor or sex trafficking. By failing to secure our border and fix legal loopholes, we are enriching the criminal cartels, making them more powerful in Central America and Mexico, and enabling them to exploit new victims. If Congress refuses to fix these loopholes and secure our border, we are complicit in this problem. I continue to support an all-of-the-above strategy to secure our borders, including enhanced physical barriers, 21st century technology, and additional manpower. Frontline defenders have repeatedly testified before this committee about how this multi-layered approach works. I encourage my colleagues to work together to ensure that more resources are provided to the Department of Homeland Security to secure our borders in a safe and humane, compassionate way. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. I now recognize the Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rice and Ranking Member Higgins, for holding today's hearing. Today, we are joined by a panel of experts who've witnessed firsthand how the Department of Homeland Security has put in place and carried out policies directly affecting migrant families and children seeking asylum on our southern border. We must be clear, through systematic challenges with detention conditions, due process, and family screening protocols have been persistent over many years. The Trump administration is unique. No other administration has carried out a policy that deliberately separates migrant families, in some instances by default, when they reach the border at the scale we've seen over the past 2 years. This policy is seriously inconsistent with, if not a complete break from, the policy put in place by U.S. Customs and Border Protection in 2015 to maintain family unity to the great extent operationally feasible, absent a serious threat to the safety of the child. Last summer, we saw the peak of these separations, and I adamantly hope we do not see a repeat of this cruelty this summer. We now know that DHS put in place a family separation pilot program in 2017 prior to the rollout of its sub-zero tolerance policy in 2018. However, 3 independent oversight entities within the Government Accountability Office and the Inspector Generals of both DHS and the Department of Health and Human Services have since found that none of the federal agencies involved were prepared to adequately monitor families throughout the intake process or handle the number of children suddenly in their custody once their parents were criminally charged. Whether this lack of preparation was incompetence or deliberate is what this committee intends to find out with certainty. Real oversight of this family separation policy and how DHS and CBP are currently treating asylum-seeking families and children is long overdue. Whether DHS and CBP begin to change their processes will go a long way in demonstrating their intentions. 3 of our witnesses here today can attest to the impacts of this lack of preparation combined with other deterrent-only policies have had on migrant children and their families. There have been a steady increase in the number of families and unaccompanied children presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents and at ports of entry for months now. Unfortunately, I understand that necessary family separations continue today. During my recent visit to the border, I saw at least one facility that is not at all appropriate for holding vulnerable populations, particularly small children, for extended periods of time. I find it truly unfortunate that it took the death of 2 young children in CBP custody last December for DHS to begin conducting more medical assessments and to request funding to more humanely handle families and children in their custody. There has to be a better way. What we will discuss today will help the committee hold DHS accountable for its part in the trauma inflicted on these children and families. I also look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses on how we can prevent any further harm from being carried out by the federal government on these families. The proposal and action carried out by DHS to date have proven inadequate, harmful, and deadly. Committee Democrats intend to advocate for smart, effective, and humane alternatives to handling the humanitarian challenge, and I thank our witnesses for informing our efforts by joining us today. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Additionally, I ask unanimous consent that the members of the full committee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses as appropriate. Without objection, so ordered. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Ms. Jennifer Podkul, is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at Kids in Need of Defense, or KIND. Ms. Podkul is an international human rights lawyer and expert on issues affecting immigrant children. Prior to joining KIND, she was a senior program officer at the Women's Refugee Commission, where she researched issues facing vulnerable migrants and advocated for improved treatment. Next, we have Ms. Michelle Brané, who is the director of the Migrant Rights and Justice Program at the Women's Refugee Commission. Ms. Brané is one of the nation's foremost experts on U.S. asylum protections and detention policies for migrants. She has more than 25 years of experience working on immigration and human rights issues, including serving as an attorney advisor with the Department of Justice Board of Immigration Appeals, where she specialized in asylum cases. Next, we have Dr. Julie M. Linton, who is the co-chair of Immigrant Health Special Interest Group at the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Linton holds a BS in psychology from Duke University, an MD from the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Philadelphia, and completed her residency in pediatrics at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She has authored numerous publications and testified before Congress once before on the department's family separation policy. Finally, we have Mr. Tim Ballard, the founder and CEO of Operation Underground Railroad. Before founding OUR, Mr. Ballard worked as a special agent within the Department at Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations. While there, he was assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force program and deployed as an undercover operative for the U.S. Child Sex Tourism Jump Team to combat child sex trafficking rings. He continues this work at OUR by supporting and training law enforcement agencies on best practices to liberate children from these trafficking rings. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his or her statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Podkul.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of the subcommittee. I'm here to represent Kids in Need of Defense, a national organization dedicated to promoting the rights of child migrants and ensuring that every child has access to high-quality legal representation. I'm grateful the subcommittee is holding today's hearing to look at the systematic and intentional attacks this administration has launched against some of the most vulnerable people in the world, migrant children. Before I begin recounting the ways in which recent policy changes have harmed children, I want to start by telling you a bit about some of our clients who, thanks to my dedicated colleagues, have legal status and are able to live safely in the United States. I think it's important for all of us to have an understanding of who these kids are and not just think of them as numbers or statistics. There's Jonathan, who came here from Guatemala, who's almost finished with high school and is planning on joining the Marines when he graduates. There's Alicia, who came to the U.S. as a teenager and learned English incredibly quickly, and then also graduated high school early. And then there's Alejandra. She created a nationally recognized anti-bullying campaign when she was in high school, and then she secured a full scholarship to a prestigious college. See, this is what happens when we give kids a fair chance. However, instead of dedicating resources to ensure that our system is able to efficiently process and fairly adjudicate the cases of children seeking protection, this administration has invested in malicious deterrence tactics. When a child has fled torture, is being persecuted by criminals that even the police are afraid of, or witnesses the murder of her close family members, they can't be deterred from fleeing. Draconian policies will only serve to make their lives worse and waste taxpayer money. Family separation, one of the most high-profile methods of deterrence by this administration, has been condemned across the board. Yet separations are continuing to happen on a regular basis, and we don't know why. There is still no public guidance on when CBP can separate a child from their parent. There is no requirement a licensed child welfare professional screen the child, and there is no way for a parent to challenge the separation if it was done in error. Kind attorneys are still seeing cases in which separations are not fully tracked, Information about extended family members is not captured, and it is not clear the separation was truly in the best interest of the child. Another harmful policy that has been the information sharing agreement between DHS and ORR. The use of information obtained by ORR during the sponsor vetting process to conduct immigration enforcement against sponsors not only causes emotional distress to the children, but it's resulted in a ballooning population of children held in ORR custody. In violation of the spirit of the Flores Agreement, children are being held in unlicensed emergency facilities for months on end. Detention fatigue has resulted in many children giving up their valid claims for protection. Children should not be used as bait for immigration enforcement. Compliance with the Flores Settlement Agreement and minimum standards of detention must be a priority for every agency that holds children. Finally, in an attempt to deny any kind of access to our justice system, this administration has tried to slam the door completely on those arriving at our southern border. Children are being turned away and denied the right to ask for protection, both between ports of entry as well as at the official ports. This is in violation of the law. I have interviewed children and families sleeping on bridges and living in extremely dangerous conditions in Mexico, all along the border from San Diego to Brownsville. Some are waiting for months to be able to present themselves and ask for protection. If they're lucky enough to be processed, they're then put into freezing cold CBP facilities that are not appropriate for children and are not staffed with appropriate child welfare or medical professionals. This has resulted in children getting very sick, and as you know, some even dying. Our enforcement system has not modernized to catch up with what has been a reality for many years now, that children make up a large percentage of the population that DHS is encountering. Enforcement methods used for single adult males are not appropriate for children in search of safety. DHS must implement the directives set forth in their funding bill and stop using sponsor information for enforcement purposes. They must direct funding to ensure adequate medical treatment for children in DHS custody, and they must not continue to engage in efforts that preclude children's access to the United States. Because deterrence won't work, we must instead focus on addressing the root causes of their migration. We must ensure our justice system offers due process and fair adjudications, and that decisions reflect the best interest of the child. We must stop hurting children who are coming to us asking for help. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Podkul. I now recognize Ms. Brané to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman and members of the committee, for giving me the opportunity to testify today. The Women's Refugee Commission has been monitoring immigration enforcement and border screening policies for almost 20 years. Whether the policy we are discussing today was a zero-tolerance policy with the primary focus of prosecution or an explicit family separation policy, the consequences are clear. Thousands of families seeking protection at our southern border were separated. One of the many shocking realities we must face is that even after making a decision to implement a policy that they knew would result in the separation of thousands of families, no one in this administration, not DHS, not CBP, not ICE, no one did anything to create a system for the actual separations, for identifying and tracking separated children or minimizing trauma, or for attending to their basic needs. The actual process for separating families was chaotic, cruel, inefficient, and dangerous. And in my opinion, it was criminally negligent. In June 2018, at the height of family separations, I spent 2 days at the border speaking with parents and children in CBP custody. It is impossible to overstate the impact of seeing government officials performing as part of their daily job functions what can only be described as cruelty. Families were separated before my eyes with no explanation, no opportunity for goodbyes, no humanity. In one case, I was speaking to a father and his 9-year-old daughter when an officer interrupted to say, "I have to take the girl." When I asked him why and where he was taking her, he said, "I don't know, ma'am, to a shelter. I just have her on my list." The officer did not explain that this was a separation, and in fact, he didn't even seem to be acknowledging it himself. But this was a separation happening before my eyes, and it was described only as being about, quote, taking her to the bus. The officer didn't even intend to give them an opportunity to say goodbye. At the Ursula Processing Center, there were over 500 separated children in cages when I arrived. Several of the children were listed as being 1 or 2 or 0 years old. 0 years old. I asked to see some of these babies. The officer told me that he couldn't find them. He said that he had called their names and they had not answered. I was incredulous. Of course, they did not answer. They were babies. I asked who was caring for these babies, and he told me he did not know. Eventually, he brought me a toddler, listed as being 2 years old. A 16-year-old girl was holding the child. She told me that she had found the child there in her cage. When the toddler cried, no guards or officials helped. This 16-year-old girl, who had also been separated from her mother, found this toddler in a cage. When the toddler cried, she comforted her. She changed her diapers. She helped her get in line for food and gave her bottles. At night, she sang the crying girl to sleep. She had been there for 3 days, and she was worried about what would happen to this little girl when she was transferred away. I eventually discovered that this toddler had been separated from her aunt and that Border Patrol had incorrectly recorded her name and her age. We will never know what would have happened to this child if I had not been there that day, or if a 16-year-old girl had not met or cared for her. And what's worse is that we will never know what other cases like hers existed that day or on any other, because DHS did not and still does not track separations. Another child I met with was a 5-year-old boy. He was sobbing and inconsolable. He was clutching a rolled-up photocopy of his mother's ID. Someone must have given it to him before they separated them. This piece of paper was the first indication I had seen in my 2 days in those facilities that indicated that anyone in Border Patrol cared at all about what was happening to these children. These outrageous and traumatizing separations did not just happen to these families. This was not a natural disaster. This was an affirmative decision and instruction given by and to government actors, and it was done to these families. Even today, separations continue, and there is still no system in place for tracking families. I thank the committee for holding this hearing and for continuing to ask these critical questions. We must ask how this happened. Either the government considered but did not care about the consequences of separation, or they did not even consider the consequences of their own policy, a conclusion that is just as shocking and disturbing in its negligence. Why were policies to receive, process, and manage arriving families humanely not even considered? There must be consequences. It is essential in order to ensure that this does not happen again. Thank you again, and I'm available later to answer questions about these stories and practices at the border.
Thank you, Ms. Brané. I now recognize Dr. Linton to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of the Homeland Security Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm Dr. Julie Linton, a practicing pediatrician in Greenville, South Carolina, where my work is focused on the care of children and immigrant families. I'm the co-chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Immigrant Health Special Interest Group and co-author of the 2017 AAP Policy Statement, Detention of Immigrant Children. On behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics, or the AAP, and our 67,000 members, thank you for holding today's hearing. The AAP is nonpartisan and pro-children. Pediatricians care about the health and well-being of all children, no matter where they or their parents were born. As pediatricians, we know that children do best when they are together with their families. After reading media reports in March of 2017 that the Department of Homeland Security was considering a policy that would separate mothers from their children upon arriving at the US border, we immediately spoke out against this proposed policy. We subsequently wrote to DHS 6 times to urge the agency to reject such a policy. The AAP also issued roughly half a dozen statements about why family separation devastates the most basic relationship we know, the relationship between a child and a parent. We have said repeatedly that separating children from their parents contradicts everything we stand for as pediatricians, protecting and promoting children's health. Today, I will underscore the harmful effects of separation, processing, and detention based on what we know from the scientific literature and what I know from caring for patients. Prolonged exposure to serious stress, known as toxic stress, can disrupt a child's brain architecture and adversely impact short and long-term health. When little bodies are in a constant fight or flight response, stress hormones such as cortisol remain elevated, continuously activating the nervous system and suppressing the immune response. A critical role of a parent or known caregiver is to buffer stress. Separation from a parent robs children of this buffer. Separated children can thus face immediate health problems, including physical symptoms like headaches and stomach pain, changes in body functions like eating, sleeping, and toileting, behavior problems like anger, irritability, and aggression, and difficulty with learning and memory. Children who have been separated may also experience feelings of mistrust, embarrassment, guilt, and shame. In the long term, children who have been separated may be susceptible to chronic diseases such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, diabetes, and heart disease. I have personally witnessed the impact of family separation. In June of 2018, I cared for an 8-year-old boy who, with his pregnant mother, had fled violence and direct personal threats in Central America to seek safe haven in the US. Since the zero tolerance policy was in effect at the time, I gently asked the boy and his mother if they had been separated at the border. With my question, a chilling silence arose. The boy began to breathe quickly, and his mother tearfully whispered, 7 days. For 7 days, this boy and his pregnant mother did not know about the other's location or safety. Their separation was shorter than many children harmed by the zero tolerance policy, and he still suffered the consequences. That day in my office, his mother reported he could no longer sleep through the night. He had trouble being away from her for even short periods of time. His mother shared that he was a shell of his previous self. Children are not little adults. To untrained eyes, they can appear quite healthy, even when their systems begin to shut down. Tragically, this was the case for Jacqueline Calmaquin and Felipe Gomez Alonso, who died in the custody of Customs and Border Protection in December. The AAP, joined by 13 national medical and mental health provider organizations, wrote to Secretary Nielsen and Commissioner McAleenan, urging they take specific, meaningful steps to ensure that all children in CBP custody receive appropriate medical and mental health screening and necessary follow-up care by trained providers. We urge our federal agencies to apply a child-focused lens when considering policies that could have an impact on child health. Additionally, children should not be placed in unlicensed facility, whether run by HHS or DHS. The findings of the HHS Office of Inspector General about tornillo and family separation are alarming and should be addressed. As separations continue to occur, we must compel all federal agencies to put the best interests of the child ahead of any other priority. Child welfare experts, not law enforcement agents, are best positioned to make the determination of what is in a child's best interest. It is critical that all reunified children receive appropriate medical and mental health care in the community to support healing from the traumatic experiences of family separation, processing, and detention. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Dr. Linton. I now recognize Mr. Ballard to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, and members of this subcommittee. My intention today is to focus on the millions of children who are caught in the horrific web of child trafficking. Many of these children are sexually exploited as subjects of child pornography and as victims of rape for money here in the United States. Any conclusions I offer are based on real child trafficking cases that I have worked directly on over the past 17 years. I started in the CIA, and then for 12 years I worked as a special agent and undercover operator for Homeland Security investigations. 10 of those years I worked combating sex trafficking on the southern border. For the last 5 years, I have served as the founder and CEO of the anti-trafficking organization Operation Underground Railroad, working hand in hand with law enforcement agencies in 20 countries and 22 states here. We have rescued over 2,000 victims and assisted in the arrest of nearly 1,100 traffickers. Much of my work has been based on simple economics. The United States is one of the highest, if not the highest, consumers of child pornography in the world. We are the demand for child sex. As such, traffickers around the world seek to bring children to the United States where they can sell them for sex and make a lot of money. My number one personal and professional goal has been to keep these children out of the sick hands of American pedophiles. I want to share one case in which we failed to do this. The victim was a foreign-born child around 12 years old who we will call Lily. Lily was kidnapped south of our border. She was then taken along with several other children her age and smuggled into the United States, not through a port of entry, but rather through parts of the southern border without significant barriers. Lily's traffickers easily transported her to New York City, where she and the other children were raped for money. Lily, 30 to 40 times a day for 5 years. She believes that she was raped in New York City over 20,000 times. She eventually escaped, and my foundation is now caring for her as she prepares to testify in federal court against her captors. In accordance with U.S. laws as a survivor of sex trafficking in America, Lily has been granted legal status, and we are helping her complete the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. The U.S. Attorney's Office has requested that we not publicly share any more information until this case is completed, the trial is completed later this year. Recounting her experience, Lily has often asked me a simple yet profound question. Why was there no wall along the southern border for me? A wall would have saved me, she says. What is she talking about? It's very simple, really. During a time of crisis or emergency, any of us knows to call 911 because that number bridges the gap between bad guys trying to hurt us and good guys, police officers who can help us. Lily knows that strong barriers would have likely forced her captors to take their chances at a port of entry, thus placing her face-to-face with well-trained and well-equipped U.S. officers who were specifically looking for victims of sex trafficking. I would have yelled out to one of them, Lily has told me regretfully. Instead, I was raped over 20,000 times. Contrast that case with another case I worked. I was a lead agent on this case. The trafficker was an American named Earl Buchanan. He kept children, both little boys and girls, in San Bernardino, California, where he lived and where he repeatedly raped them and filmed his rape of these children for his pornography collection. On the night of July 3rd, 2006, Buchanan was attempting to smuggle a 5-year-old Mexican boy through the Calexico, California port of entry. Fortunately for the boy, he was coming from the Mexicali, Mexico region, which is blocked by miles and miles of significant border barriers. This compelled Buchanan to take his chances at the Calexico port of entry, where a U.S. officer had the opportunity to look Buchanan in the eye, recognize that something was off, then liberate that child and arrest Buchanan. This led directly to the rescue of almost a dozen other children that were sex victims held by this American monster, who will now spend the rest of his life in jail. As I compare these two cases and dozens just like them that I have added to my written testimony and submitted to this committee, my conclusion is that we have a much greater chance of catching human traffickers and liberating their victims at a port of entry than we do where there is no barrier. I've been quite surprised of late to see politicians and others who are opposed to building barriers hail the successes of drug seizures and rescues at the ports of entry and using those successes to say, see, we don't need barriers. We have ports of entry. Bad guys come through ports of entries. In fact, we don't have ports of entry without walls. The walls and the barriers are the thing that compelled Buchanan to take the child into the port of entry in the first place. From his vantage point on the night of July 3rd, 2006, with this poor child captive in his van, he only had one choice, the port of entry. And that was thanks to barriers that existed where he happened to be working his evil works. Currently, with hundreds of miles of open border, too many traffickers have a choice. Sadly, we as a nation are providing them that choice. In the end, the boy was liberated and Buchanan was locked up. In Lily's case, the traffickers were liberated while she was locked up and raped thousands of times in our country. The difference? The boy had barriers to save him. Lily did not. Paula Felix is a former Mexican congresswoman and current senior Mexican administration official working on anti-trafficking policies directly for Mexican President Manuel López Obrador. I worked very closely with her to find children in Mexico who were en route to being smuggled into the United States. Responding to the debate over barriers in this country, Felix declared, quote, "It is very disappointing to me that people in the United States would ignore or downplay the many Hispanic children being smuggled into the United States outside of legal ports of entry and forced into the hell of sex slavery."
Mr. Ballard, I'm sorry, you have to wrap up.
Okay. I think my point has been made. I'm glad I agree with all my colleagues on this panel. I just hope we give voice to all the other children who are being brought through barrier-less parts of the border. We need to focus on them as well and help them as well. Thank you.
I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Ms. Brané, I want to start with you. Secretary Nielsen testified before a full committee of this Homeland Security Committee a couple of weeks ago, and she testified that every single parent who had been separated from a child had been given the opportunity to take their child back with them before they were deported. And she testified that actually they were given that opportunity, I believe she said almost an exact quote, on multiple occasions. Is that true?
No. I mean, in my experience, I've spoken directly to parents who actually begged to have their children taken, returned with them when they were deported, but did not have that opportunity. And in some cases, parents even signed voluntary removals and agreed to leave the country after being told that was the only way they would get their children back, and yet they were still deported without their child.
So that would not be an accurate, truthful statement? Correct. Okay. Now, can you tell me briefly, can you explain, I know briefly, but I only have 5 minutes. Can you explain the Family Case Management Program, and can you explain what DHS's justification was for ending it?
The program was an alternative to detention that involved case managers assigned to families who were seeking asylum generally. The case manager worked with the family to ensure that they had a place to live, that they knew when their appointments were, when their hearings were, maybe connected them to pro bono attorneys if they could. And the program was, by all accounts, extremely successful. The government itself found that it was 100% successful. Later studies have found that it was 99% successful in ensuring appearance to all hearings and appointments. It only costs about $35 a day as compared to many hundreds and hundreds of dollars for detaining or separating families. The administration terminated it early in June of 2017. Before it was intended to end. It had already been sort of approved for many more years, and they gave no reason as far as I know.
Dr. Linton, before zero tolerance was formally announced, what actions did the AAP take to warn the Department of Homeland Security about the dangers of family separation?
Given the limited time, I'll refrain from going through the entire timeline of context, but we, as I mentioned in my opening statement, communicated 6 times by letter regarding the concerns, as well as a number of statements that were made both in the press as well as letters to the Department of Homeland Security, specifically expressing our concerns beginning as early as March of 2017.
Ms. Podkul, it's my understanding, and tell me if this is accurate, that DHS has not hired any social workers or child welfare experts. Is that true?
I have seen 1 or 2 child welfare workers who are hired on contract to work in the Ursula facility, for example, when they have a baby there, but it has not been consistent, and those people are not responsible for any of the important screening that takes place.
Now, you also stated in your written testimony that ICE arrested more than 400 potential sponsors of unaccompanied minors. And by the way, we know that that's the term given to kids who were taken away from their parents. They then became unaccompanied minors, even though they weren't. For charges the agency claimed were related to federal smuggling crimes. Subsequent news reports have stated that these charges were not, in fact, related to smuggling. Are you aware of what these individuals were charged with?
We're not. Once the potential sponsor was taken by ICE and then detained by ICE and put into removal proceedings, we're not sure what happened to them. What we do know is it resulted in children languishing in detention and not having anyone to provide care for them at no cost to the government while they went through their court process.
You also stated in your written testimony that migrants must wait months to present their asylum claims at the border. Has CBP or USCIS cut back, as far as you know, on the number of asylum claims they're processing at legal ports of entry? And if they have they given any justification for that?
I don't know of any justification, but I can tell you just last week I was crossing the bridge in Brownsville, Texas, and the agent who processed me, because I had a U.S. passport, said, you know, we used to just let them all come in and present themselves, you know, and right behind me was a huge encampment of 50 people sleeping in tents on the bridge.
Dr. Linton, I just want to go back to you quickly for the last question. You have observed families and children staying in CBP custody longer than the 72-hour limit. How long are most families and children reporting being kept in CBP holding facilities since October of 2018? And can you just briefly give us some examples of the health implications of staying in those conditions for extent? By the way, we're talking about cages with mylar coverings, sometimes in wet clothing, separated from family members. Can you just give us a brief explanation?
Yeah, so the children that I care for in the community, both in previously in North Carolina and now South Carolina, report stays of anywhere between 2 days and 8 days in CBP processing facilities. And that's in the past several months, those are the numbers that I've heard from the families I take care of. The conditions place the same risks that I discussed in my opening statement regarding the risks of toxic stress in the short term from being in the conditions of lights being on 24/7, which is incredibly disorienting, cage-like fencing that extends from the floor to the ceiling, and children lying on concrete floors with a mat and a mylar blanket, include physical symptoms such as headaches and stomach aches, include changes in memory and learning, and in the long run, place them at risk for complex medical problems such as depression, anxiety, heart disease, and diabetes.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. America should be reminded that 20 years ago, most individuals illegally crossing the border were single adult males from Mexico. They'd take temporary jobs in the U.S., they'd send their money home, and they'd go back to Mexico. Today, the majority of apprehensions at the southwest border are families and unaccompanied children arriving from Central America because of the current legal precedent. It's the job of this Congress to fix. Unaccompanied minors and members of a family unit must be released into the United States after 20 days to await immigration proceedings. As a result, 98.9% of families, 98.2% of unaccompanied children apprehended in fiscal year 2017 who originated outside of Mexico remain in the United States. Family apprehensions for the first 5 units of fiscal year 2019 are 800% higher than the total number in 2013. We all concurred we have to take care of the children that end up on American soil. But we should agree in a bipartisan manner that this is a problem that begins with trafficking far south of our border with Mexico. Mr. Ballard, based on your experience, do you think more children are separated in the process of attempting to reach our southwest border or by our government once they get here? Are they separated from their families before they get here or when they get here?
I believe that, I don't know exact numbers, but the separation of children before they get here is astronomical because we have policies that encourage cartels to take children and use them in the smuggling process because there's an incentive to have a child in your hand because of our current policies. So I worry tremendously about these children who are being used as pawns, and then you understand, the cartels are the ones who are doing the smuggling. And they're smuggling these children. 80 to 90% of them are being recovered outside of our ports of entry. They're choosing to go outside. What about the ones that didn't get recovered?
And based on your professional experience, why are the children being brought across the southwest border between ports of entry instead of legally at ports of entry?
Because our ports of entry are armed with well-trained and well-equipped officers who are looking for children and looking for cases of abuse.
Do you concur that enhanced physical barriers and enhanced technology to detect attempted crossings along our southwest border would help victims of human trafficking?
Absolutely. It would drive them to the ports of entry where there's good guys there to help them.
I'm a proponent of addressing this problem that we face with an all-of-the-above approach. Technology to detect an attempted illegal crossing, enhanced physical barriers to delay or deter an attempted illegal crossing, enhanced capacity to respond to that illegal crossing by increased boots on the ground, all-weather roads, vehicles, and enhanced capacity to process these children of God that do end up on American soil after a treacherous and criminal journey. And we need an enhanced capacity to process these human beings. And it's an incredible challenge because of the change of the demographic of the folks that are trying to cross into America illegally. Ms. Linton, I respect your testimony, madam, and I respect your passion and your love for children. But I would ask you, have you interviewed the children that have experienced trauma on the journey to our southwest border at the hands of criminal organizations, coyotes, and human traffickers?
I believe you're referring to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct. So thank you for the question, Congressman. I take care of children who have experienced trauma in countries of origin and during the journey, and at the time they arrive on our border is when the trauma should stop. And what I'm witnessing in the kids that I take care of
We
is that
concur,
they're
and I have limited
re-traumatized.
time. Do you believe that this Congress should provide the professional law enforcement men and women that are tasked with securing our southern border and protecting those who have illegally entered our country and processing these human beings? Do you believe that this Congress should provide the necessary funding that's been requested by our border security professionals so that we can protect these children?
As a pediatrician, I prioritize the health and well-being of every child in my care, and I believe that trauma should only end when they arrive on our border, and we should process every child with compassion, dignity,
I
and
concur,
respect.
madam, and I believe that my colleagues and I are responsible for providing the needed funding for border security in all phases so that we can serve these children of God entering our country illegally. I think we should stop them before they get here by working closely together to provide the needed funding and enhance technology and physical barriers that border security has requested. Madam Chairwoman, thank you for indulging me. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I now recognize Mr. Thompson for his questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. As a father and grandfather, I am very concerned with how we treat children when they get to our border. We should not separate them from their parents. We should not put them in cages. We should provide adequate medical and other care that they need. As Americans, we're a nation of laws. Our value system says that we should take care of people. Our laws say if you get here and ask for asylum, it's not a go to the end of the line or remain in Mexico until your number is called. We have to accept you. So part of what I hear from the witnesses, the majority of the witnesses, is that our system is not adequate. This hearing today is to talk about the separation policies and what perspectives we see from the border. So I think it's clear that we have to fix it. Now, for the record, we have never provided any less money than the department has ever requested for anything. So it's never been that we haven't provided the money. We have always provided the money. There are some 5,000 vacancies right now within CBP because Congress has been generous to fund them. We just have not been able to employ the people to do that. So I think we need to at least put on record that if the children of God get to this border, we have to clearly take care of them. And children should not be used as anything other than who they are, human beings. So, Dr. Linton, you've had experience with it. So is your testimony before this committee that with the present policies in place, children have a higher percentage of issues because the policies are inadequate, and that those 67,000 members of your organization have already been on record expressing that concern?
The American Academy of Pediatrics has expressed concerns about the current policies at the border that include separation of children from their parents without clear recognition that that child is at risk at the hand of the parent, and without determination by a family court that that is justified. We're on record with our concerns about detention in family detention centers, and we're on record with concerns regarding the conditions in the current Customs and Border Protection processing centers.
So, for the record, those 6 letters, did they get responded to?
We have had no meaningful engagement with DHS regarding family separation.
Will you provide the committee with copies of those 6 letters that you sent to DHS?
Thank you, Congressman. I'd be happy to provide the committee with any record of the communications we've had with DHS.
Thank you very much. Ms. Brané, you've had experience working with just the migrant rights and justice. What is your opinion of the present system with respect to family separation at the border?
Well, I'm extremely concerned that even after everything that we've described here today and all the public outcry, congressional outcry, and orders from a court, from a federal court, to my knowledge, there's still no system in place for tracking the separations of families. And we still, as Ms. Podkul testified, have seen families who are separated without proper information being given about why, or any plan for how to reunify if that ends up being the proper outcome.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I think at the hearing you referenced, we asked the Secretary to provide us some data on how many children we had in custody and what have you. And it's my understanding that we've yet to receive the formal reply. So I'd like to go on record reaffirming the committee's interest in getting the information. So if we have to do legislation, we at least need to know from a statistical standpoint what we're addressing.
I agree, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I yield
you.
back.
The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First, for the record, I want to say when Secretary Nielsen came here, she testified that of the children that were separated from their families under the zero tolerance policy, only six children remain in ORR custody, and there was legitimate reasons for that. I do want to get to this, and I think all of you have compelling testimony, but I think what we're missing here is what is the root of this problem, and what's the cause of this problem. I contend the cause of this problem is our loose immigration laws, and laws that are asylum laws that actually incentivize migrants to travel thousands and thousands of miles to get here with their children. So my question, actually, and I just want to add that Secretary Nielsen testified that these cartels are paid $6,000 a person, $6,000 a person to come here, and it's caused partially by our loose asylum laws that incentivize people to come here. So my question to Ms. Podkul, would you support legislation that would revise our asylum laws so that this incentivization of cartels to bring children and women here that are getting raped, would you agree with legislation to curtail that?
I think it's really important that we maintain the protections that we have in our system now. What I would support is increased refugee processing in home country. There are a lot of kids who might be able to ask for protection in their home country, and we could revise their case, and then that would avoid them having to make the dangerous journey here.
Thank you. Mr. Ballard, thank you for your testimony. I guess from your experience, I'd like to know if you could contrast the treatment of children by cartels and smugglers as they're traveling thousands of miles versus the treatment they get once they get to the border and they're in our United States hands.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that by saying, again, I agree with this panel, with my colleagues here, and in no way would I want to distract or detract from the plight of these children and what they're going through that are recovered. However, from my experience talking to the children who didn't get recovered, who are largely, I think, are being ignored in this overall debate, I just gave you an example of one who was raped 20,000 times. So they went through hunger and loneliness and all these horrible things outside of the care of CBP because they never got that opportunity. Instead, they were taken to the pedophiles of America and raped and abused in this way. And we are working on several cases like this. Our prosecutors are prosecuting these trafficking rings right now. The cartels, you have to go to a cartel to smuggle. So in some cases, your best case, as bad as it is, your best case is that you get recovered by CBP, and it can be bad because of our policies that need to be fixed. But much worse than that is the cartels flip them into a trafficking victim, which they do. We have reports of this. And they abuse these children. They get them past the ports of entry and sell them for sex to our American pedophiles. We have to talk about this as well.
Thank you. And my next question is for Ms. Podkul. I believe you said in your testimony that you don't agree that that our government, when they're vetting the sponsors of unaccompanied children, that if they find out that these sponsors are here illegally and that some of them may have committed crimes as well, that should be turned over to ICE. Is that what you testified?
My point is when ORR does the vetting of sponsors, what they're looking for is someone who's going to be safe and who's willing to care for that child while they go through our enforcement process. That's the priority. So when ORR is looking at information, that information should really focus on the child welfare. I think ICE has its own mission of immigration enforcement, but using children as bait for immigration enforcement is what I'm concerned about. I think ICE needs to figure out how they want to prioritize their limited resources, and that ORR should stay in its lane and really focus on its mandate that Congress gave it, which is to prioritize child welfare and make sure kids
So,
go through
excuse
the
me,
court
so
process.
then that's a yes, that you don't want our government, ORR, to basically, if they find out that the sponsor is here illegally or has committed a crime, to turn that over to authorities, correct?
I believe that information should not be used for immigration enforcement purposes. It should only be, ORR should be making their decision based on what they think is in the best interest of the child, and then ICE has its own job to conduct and prioritize its own resources.
Thank you.
So I just want to say, I think it's important that we not conflate these two issues. Family separation is a completely separate issue from human trafficking. Everyone who's sitting up here wants to address the issue of human trafficking. And I with the chairman's indulgence, maybe in the future we could do a panel on that. But I think it is disingenuous to conflate the two when they really have nothing to do with each other. Not every family unit that presents itself at a port of entry or in between a port of entry is a human trafficker. So I just think we need to make that clear. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the ranking member as well for holding this most important hearing. I would concur with you, Ms. Rice, that family separation, let's not mix that with other issues. I think family separation is part of implementing a policy of keeping refugees away from this country. When we talk about loopholes, That's really the law of the United States, which is our refugee law. By separating families, we're essentially saying, don't come. I just got back from Tijuana, where I spent a few days looking at the refugee camps. And what I found, Mr. Ballard, what you said about those sex victims, just child, you haven't even started to scratch the surface. I saw girls as young as 4 years old being trafficking. And in those brothels, big business, customers are the Americans coming across the border and doing whatever it is that they're paying to do. One young girl, 6 years old, for $100 a night, she was used at brothels as much as they could use her. Terrible. And you see this story repeated over and over again, but let's not get caught up in the weeds here, because a lot of refugees now in Tijuana, Mexico, a lot of non-governmental organizations going in to help, the churches, not only Catholic, but other NGOs. You got refugees from all over the world, okay? And you're not seeing this on the television sets anymore, because a lot of them are essentially becoming very invisible, starting to get jobs in the area. But refugee crisis will continue to be the case. And I'll tell you how much our government is not recognizing this issue. Do you know what happens? You can walk up to the border and say, I want to claim refugee status. Do you know what happens? There's a book. There is a book. And I walked up to him. I walked across the border and said, I want to come in. I want to see where that book is. I said, who keeps this book? Nobody would answer the question. I asked the U.S. consulate. I asked the Mexicans, who keeps this sacred book? Nobody could answer. And when I asked the U.S. Consular General there, she said, we have no jurisdiction in Mexico. Bottom line is, a bunch of folks keep a book. And if you walk up and say, I want refugee status, they'll give you a number and a piece of paper and say, come back when we call you. This is about a legal process, a U.S. legal process that starts with somebody that's been unappointed, somebody out of the blue that's keeping this book. I'm running out of time, but Madam, I also 2 weeks ago went into Central America. I visited Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. President of Honduras told me, Lou, the reason we have so many refugees is folks are looking for hope. They're looking for a job. Says the U.S. exports 3 things to this area: drug money, gangs, and weapons. And when I went and I started to visit their centers of training their youth to get a job in the area so they could have hope, that's what it's about. I believe that, contrary to my vote, contrary to my wishes, the president will build a wall between us and Mexico. And I predict in 5 to 10 years, we will be back debating the issue of drug smuggling and refugees. The bottom line is, in Latin America today, we have a refugee crisis. It's Central America right now. We haven't even begun to look at Venezuela. There are about 2 to 3 million Venezuelans right now in South America under refugee status. And until we figure out in this country that for the last 200 years, under the President Monroe's famous Monroe Doctrine, we told the world, the Americas are our jurisdiction, stay away. The problem is, we didn't finish our job. 1823, Monroe Doctrine. 200 years, we forgot to administer, we forgot to work Central America on the economic side. Madam Chair, this is not going away. We will build a wall. We will address security in this country, but it's not going to stop fentanyl from coming in from China, drugs, cocaine from Colombia, and heroin from Mexico, because there's just too much money in the business that will corrupt Mexicans, it will corrupt Canadians, the way it corrupts Americans. And finally, let me say, when it comes to the issue of mixing refugees, drugs, cartels, doesn't work. President of Honduras told us that those big groups of folks coming over, okay, they're organized essentially by the same folks. Because like one of our colleagues said, it's not $6,000, it's $6,000 to $10,000 per person that they will charge you to smuggle you to the U.S. The way you get a discount is you all work together, you get together, and you walk a few hundred miles to get to the U.S. And then when they get here, they find out that there's no line to come into the U.S., so they stay in Mexico, they stay in Tijuana. Madam Chair, I'd love to talk to you about my journeys in Central America this last month, but that's in another story and another time. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Correa. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Ballard, first I want to thank you for your service to your country, both in CIA and working for the department as it relates to the work you've performed across our border. 2 weeks ago, Secretary Nielsen was here during her testimony before this committee. She classified the current conditions along our southwest border, and she said that she believed that there was a human trafficking crisis. Do you agree with her assessment?
Yes, I do.
She also testified that she believed that there was a drug trafficking crisis. Do you believe with her assessment that there's a drug trafficking crisis across our southwest border?
Yes, I do.
And finally, she testified that she believed that there was an immigration crisis along our border. Do you believe that as well?
Yes, I do.
Now, I want to focus, Mr. Ballard and the other witnesses, just specifically here today on human trafficking. You, in your report, I believe you properly describe human trafficking. You say human trafficking is a plague and an evil that must be eradicated. Because this is such an important and tragic issue, it is not fair and not right for these modern-day slaves to be caught in the middle of a political battle. And then throughout your testimony, you set forth what you believe is a method in which we can combat human trafficking. You say on page 7 of your report, you say that barriers along our border will be able to save children from slavery and significantly decrease the horrific sexual assaults along our border. You say on page 6 of your testimony, based on my extensive experience along the southwest border, working with every federal agency that operates there, we are much more likely to slow the flow of trafficking into our country if it's through a port of entry compared to a borderless border. And I know that barriers push people to points of entry. On page 5, you say, with borders in place, traffickers are either pushed to a port of entry or required to be stagnant as they plan for entry, which creates opportunity for us to execute operations that rescues children and puts criminals behind bars. And then finally on page 4, you say, I know that we are more likely to effectively fight human trafficking if we close open borders, crossings, and drive traffickers to ports of entry. Mr. Ballard, is your testimony that if we close our borders and we funnel all traffic through the ports of entry, that you, based upon your experience and the work that you've done, you believe that this will be an effective tool in fighting our battle against human trafficking? Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I want to ask the other witnesses on this panel, Dr. Linton, again, we're talking just on the human trafficking portion of this hearing. Do you believe that if individuals are forced to enter the country through ports of entry, that we will be more effective in our ability to identify and fight human trafficking?
As a pediatrician, I can only comment that we support the protections as outlined in the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, or TVPRA, that would recommend screening all children for human trafficking, but I can't comment on border security. Thank you.
And would we have a more effective approach of screening all children that are entering if they're entering through a port of entry versus entering across the unsecured portion of our border?
The majority of children that I take care of in my clinic are presenting themselves and asking for asylum when they arrive at our border.
Same question to you, Ms. Brané. Do you believe the same thing, that if we are able to have individuals come across through ports of entry versus the unsecured portion of the border, that we will do a better job? And again, I'm focusing only on human trafficking. I'm not focusing, so I want to make sure that we're not clouding one issue with the other. Both are very important, but my questions are relating specifically to human trafficking. Do you believe that that would help us in our fight against human trafficking?
Absolutely, and that's why I very strongly believe that we need to stop turning children away who present themselves at ports of entry. We currently have a system in which this administration is turning away people from ports of entry, and telling them to wait or go away, and that is resulting in driving them into much more dangerous situations and risk of trafficking.
All right, but as far as what we're talking about, or what specifically I'm talking about, is where we have individuals who are bringing children into our country for the purpose of using them in drug trafficking, or excuse me, in sex trafficking. This human trafficking, I believe, and I agree with Mr. Ballard, and I think you will, each of the three of you would agree, that this, anytime that one child enters the country and is forced into prostitution, that is a tragedy, and that is a crisis, and that is something that we as a country should do everything within our power to stop. And so I want to thank each of you for appearing before you today. I want to thank each of you for your testimony, and Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guest. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a nurse, so when Secretary Nielsen testified 3 weeks ago, I asked her about how family separation impacts children's health. And when I asked her, she claimed to be unaware of basic facts on the subject, like the concept of toxic stress. And I found it totally unacceptable that she came to the hearing completely unprepared to answer basic questions like the number of children currently in detention. She couldn't even tell us a timeline of the investigations into the deaths of Felipe and Jacqueline, the 2 children who died in CBP custodies. So it's been almost 3 weeks since she looked all of us, the members on the committee, in the eye and promised to provide us with all kinds of follow-up information, but I've yet to receive any word of follow-up from her office. From a medical's perspective, if you wanted to purposely design a policy to be cruel, to hurt children, you would design it to look a lot like this administration's family separation policy. And so my questions are for you, Dr. Linton. Thank you for being here. You're here representing the American Academy of Pediatrics, and so when Secretary Nielsen was here, she claimed, again, to be unaware of this toxic stress, but you're a pediatrician. And so if you were on the panel with her, how would you explain toxic stress?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Toxic stress is serious, prolonged stress in the absence of a buffering support of a parent or loving caregiver. And what we know about stress is that each of us responds to stress. I'm stressed right now. My heart is racing, and I probably have goosebumps. And that's what we call tolerable stress. So there's positive stress, which is a wedding, very stressful but exciting, wonderful. There's tolerable stress where I have the loving support of my family to cope with, and there's toxic stress. And the family separation policy that was implemented by this administration was a form of toxic stress, which we know threatens the short and long-term health of children.
And can you describe for us the impact of family separation on the child's physical health?
Yes, so we know that toxic stress in the short term can cause changes in body function. So children may have changes in their eating. They may not be hungry. Children will frequently have difficulty sleeping. They may wet the bed or even soil themselves. They may have physical symptoms, headaches. They may have stomach aches. Their immune response is lowered when there's cortisol running through their bodies for such a long period of time. So they may be more susceptible to infection in that setting. And they also, in the long run, are at serious risk for problems such as depression, heart disease, diabetes, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yep, and so some of those you described are emotional and mental health challenges. And so can you explain how those can be both immediate and long-term?
Yes, thank you. So in the short term, you can see mental health difficulties both in terms of behavior. So you may have children who are frightened, they startle easily, they are afraid to separate from a loved one or a caregiver. They may be withdrawn, they may be depressed, they may be anxious. Developmentally, we see changes like developmental regression, so a child may not be able to speak in the same way that they could speak before. So I've seen children who have faced situations of toxic stress who lost their speech milestones. We may see children have difficulty with memory. We may have children that are not able to pay attention. What looks like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is in fact toxic stress and an inability to concentrate. And in the long run, with those chronic responses, we may see that children are at risk for depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorders, to name a few.
Thank you. And so, as you mentioned in your testimony, the toxic stress can cause permanent changes in the child's brain. So, you talked about some short-term, medium, and long-term impacts, but can you discuss the brain changes that we might expect to see?
Absolutely. So what we know about toxic stress is that when you have hormones that are not supposed to be running through the body all of the time, like cortisol, we know that it can disrupt the architecture of a developing brain. I can provide you with our policy statements on toxic stress for the record, if that would be helpful, to go through the neuroplasticity and the neurobiology of toxic stress. But what we see in behavior is that we see that children, as a result of those brain changes, have these behavioral symptoms, have these physical symptoms, have these emotional symptoms, and over time are at very serious risk for chronic illness.
Well, thank you, ma'am, so much for your work in the community and for your work with these children, who I'm sure appreciate the therapeutic interventions that you and your colleagues do provide. I also like to thank the American Academy of Pediatrics for speaking out so boldly and with a clinical evidence-based grounding in response to this national policy that's been rolled out in the face of that goes against American values in so many ways. Thank you for appearing here, and Madam Chair, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Underwood. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Torres-Small.
Thank you all for being here on this important issue. Family separation should never be a solution for our broken immigration system. It is immoral, and we know it results in traumatic and lasting effects on families, particularly the children. Unfortunately, DHS continues to separate families at the border, even though the administration officially ended its family separation policy last June. Ms. Podkul, under what circumstances is DHS continuing to separate a child from their family?
We don't know. CBP does not always give information about why they conducted the separation, what standards they decided to use, and oftentimes are doing it with no justification at all.
Dr. Linton, in your earlier remarks, you discussed recommendations for what to do regarding narrow circumstances involving danger to a child. Does the DHS ever communicate explicit guidelines on how they would make such a determination?
To my knowledge, those guidelines do not exist, and we would recommend that there be strict policy guidance that separation should never occur unless the safety of that child is at risk at the hand of the parent and a competent family court makes the decision, just like we do with every other child when we have to consider whether they should be separated.
How many children have been separated from their parents since the termination of the administration's zero-tolerance policy?
I know what we know from the reports from the OIG that we believe there were thousands more separated than the nearly 3,000 we know about, but I'm not able to comment beyond what has been reported publicly.
Does anyone else have any better idea?
Well, as I've said before, we don't know because they're still not keeping track.
Dr. Linton, as a member representing a border district, I have seen firsthand that CBP facilities are not meant to handle the influx of children and families that we are currently seeing. You discussed previously some recommendations for screening and follow-up care. How do you suggest CBP change its policies to adapt to the rise of family units and to ensure that these families are provided with quality medical care?
I believe that every child who presents to our border upon arriving, having fled conditions of trauma in their countries of origin, and as we've discussed, may have faced trauma during the journey, the trauma should stop. And so we should have every child have access to being processed in child-friendly facilities, which is not the case of current CBP processing facilities. Children should have access to screening, comprehensive medical screening, mental health services, and should also have legal representation so that their cases can be fairly heard.
Thank you. It's my understanding that when parents are separated from their child, they aren't being provided reasons for the separation. What is CBP's process for notifying parents that they will be separated? Dr. Brané?
To my knowledge, there is no process, and there continues to be no process. So it would be great to hear if they're developing something, but I have not heard of any plans to do so.
Are you aware of whether parents are given an explanation or any information?
Generally, from the cases I've heard of, they have not, but again, I think that's on an individual basis. There's no policy in place, so it may be inconsistent.
Do you know what process parents can use to appeal the separation, particularly to explain charges on their criminal record issued by the government from which they are fleeing?
To my knowledge, there's no process.
Given what you have seen from separated families, do you have recommendations on how this process could be improved?
Developing any process would be a step forward. We have made several recommendations to the administration on how they could develop better policies. One of the most important is putting child welfare professionals at Border Patrol stations and ports of entry to help with the screening and the care and the processing of these children.
And if I may add, I mean, this sounds a little basic, but even just keeping track of the separations and ensuring that the information goes to both the child and the parents so that they can maintain communication. What we see is a child can't oftentimes move forward with their legal case because it's the adult who has all the information about their case, has the documents that are necessary, has important information. And even when they have been able to keep track of the separations, it's taking longer than a week to make sure that the child and the parent can speak again after the separation.
If I could just add, I think what's really critical here is that there's some really basic common sense steps that could be taken that have not been taken.
Basic steps to save children and their families. Thank you. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Torres-Small. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chair and the ranking member for their courtesies. I really do appreciate it. My commitment to this committee is such that allowing me to question is much appreciated. So thank you so very much. Let me thank all of the witnesses who are here. A little background, I'm also on the Judiciary Committee, and remember in desperate times the formulation of this policy to transfer the holding of children from the detention process of the immigration agencies in order to protect them. With that in mind, we had no vision of thousands of children being held in facilities separated from guardians, parents, and others. I had the non-privilege of being at the border in the first coming of children unaccompanied, literally holding babies coming off buses. That's how desperate parents were, 2-year-olds. And this was no humor for the parents or no opportunistic opportunity for them. And then I recently was in a very limited return of children to parents just in the last year during this recent. And to each of you, I'm setting this a precedent so you can see, or this landscape for you. And as we were in the room, there was not a dry eye, but here's why the eyes were not dry. Because if you're a parent, you want nothing more than protect your children and for your children to see you as a protector. And so these children had come and they were playing with pretty, pretty toys. And that mother would come in with a pillowcase of her belongings. To come up to a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and to stand there and watch them play, sort of waiting for them to look up to acknowledge. As they looked up and acknowledged, there was no reaction from the children. There was no breaking away and running toward this desperate mom who had come, had been through so much, and had this pillowcase. I can see it right now. And for those of us who are parents, the worst thing you can imagine is the disassociation of your child from you, the break of the bond. So my question that I just came out of the Budget Committee to ask the Deputy Secretary of how many children there are right now, there are about 12,000 children being held. They're asking for $2 billion to deal with this. So I'm going to Ms. Podkul and Mr. Brané and Dr. Linton. I come from Texas Children's Hospital territory and work a lot with pediatricians, but give me your sense of how this committee in its jurisdiction and all the other committees can be effective in trying to get children united with their parents, but more importantly, the effect. And I only have 1.35, so if you all, I'm just going to call on you just to make your quick point that you made, but I just need to hear it again too. Mr. Barrett, let me thank you. I've been a supporter. I don't know if you're talking about the Underground Railroad with Harriet Tubman, but in any event, certainly that was a historic moment in history. But I'm just going to ask Dr. Linton and Brané and Portal, based upon what I've given you. Thank you. Now it's down to 1.12. Forgive me.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think that the committee has an opportunity to ask for accountability in the processes that include family separation, ensuring that no child is separated without being at risk at the hand of a parent, as well as safe conditions in Center and Border Patrol protection processing centers, and not using detention as a solution.
And healthcare at those facilities, would that be helpful?
Healthcare should be available to every child who comes to our border and enters this country.
On site. Thank you, Doctor. Yes, Ms. Brané, I hope I'm pronouncing your name
In
right.
addition to what Dr. Linton stated, I would say child welfare professionals at ports of entry and Border Patrol stations, facilities that comply with child welfare standards and licensing standards, and a system for tracking and sharing information.
Thank you. Ms. Podkul.
You know, these are all changes that we've been recommending today that could be done today. They could be done by COB today. So I think this committee, you know, conducting oversight on the agency to ensure that they're put into place is going to be very important in terms of making children safe.
I have a second. Can someone comment on the separation factor that I just described when the children did not respond to that parent that came into the room?
When children are separated from their parents, it's profoundly traumatizing to them, and they are sometimes takes them time to heal from the trauma that was imposed by our policy of systematically separating them. Every child should be with his or her loving and supportive parent unless that child is at risk at the hand of the parent and the family court determines that that child is not safe with that parent.
Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. I recognize the ranking member for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'd like to remind all concerned Americans that our law enforcement professionals on the border are dealing in many cases with families that are self-separating before they get to our southwest border. And we also have quite a significant concern with fraudulent family units. It's very challenging for law enforcement to deal with. And as Americans with love and compassion for the children, these guys are doing their best. We need to provide them the funding that they've requested. My colleague stated earlier that family separation is immoral. Ms. Podkul, you stated in your submitted statement that family unity is a fundamental human right. Ms. Brané, you stated that family separation policy, an extremely important matter that profoundly affects the lives of vulnerable migrant and refugee children and families. I think we're all concur that this is a serious concern. And I would ask you, Ms. Brané, have you interviewed any of the children, the 750,000 to 800,000 children, American children, that are separated from their parents, that are incarcerated in American jails?
I have not done so professionally, no.
So, but you have immigrated, you have interviewed many immigrant children.
I've interviewed many immigrant children.
I would remind America that there are approximately 750 to 800,000 American families separated because their
With all due respect,
parents
Mr.
have
Ranking
committed
Member,
crimes.
I yielded the
yield back.
time because I thought it was going to be on a relevant issue. It is not, so we're going to end here. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. With that, I ask unanimous
Madam
consent.
Chairwoman, I have a unanimous consent request.
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the remarks of Secretary Nielsen from our recent full committee hearing regarding the specific circumstances where family separations may occur. Very narrow and specific. I ask unanimous consent to be entered into the record. Well, it would be, I believe it's appropriate to enter her written statement, which includes the details I'm referring to.
Yes, because that will be taken also together with the testimony that she actually gave orally before this committee, which I think is just as relevant. So yes, that
Thank you,
we will
Madam
do.
Chairwoman.
With that, I ask unanimous consent to insert materials from Amnesty International into the hearing record. Without objection, the subcommittee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.